San Francisco was not destroyed by shaking alone. The earthquake opened the disaster, but broken urban systems, fire, emergency choices, displacement, and politics decided how large that disaster would become. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. A fault moved beneath Northern California before dawn, and in less than a minute, the city was changed. But the catastrophe people remembered, photographed, litigated, fled from, and rebuilt after was not only a geological event. It was a chain reaction inside a modern city. Gas mains broke and fed flames. Water mains broke and weakened the fight against those flames. Buildings fell, but entire districts burned. Survivors lost homes, not just to the first violent movement of the earth, but to 3 days of fire and to the decisions that followed, where refugees could live, whose neighborhoods would be restored, who would profit, and who would be blamed. At about 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, San Francisco was not fully awake. The city stood at the edge of the Pacific, crowded, ambitious, and physically vulnerable in ways many residents could not yet see. Beneath the region lay the northern San Andreas Fault, part of a system capable of storing strain over long periods and releasing it in a sudden rupture. In that early hour, there was a foreshock, then a short interval, and then the main shock. The strong shaking that followed lasted roughly 45 to 60 seconds. Less than a minute can sound almost merciful when measured against the length of a life or the age of a city. But in an earthquake, less than a minute is enough time to separate walls from foundations, to split streets, to fracture pipes, to panic animals, to throw people from beds, and to expose the hidden dependencies of urban life. A city is not only buildings. It is fuel, water, roads, wires, hospitals, docks, police stations, firehouses, and the authority people turn to when ordinary order fails. When the ground moved, those systems were tested all at once. The earthquake was felt across an enormous region. The United States Geological Survey states that shaking was felt from southern Oregon to south of Los Angeles and inland as far as central Nevada. The rupture itself was not merely a San Francisco event, even though San Francisco became its symbol. It ran along the northern San Andreas Fault, through a long reach of Northern California, and later scientific accounts would describe that rupture in terms of hundreds of miles. But in the public memory, the disaster gathered around the city because San Francisco supplied the dense human stage on which the earthquake's consequences became visible. Before dawn, the city contained about 400,000 people. Many were asleep when the first motion came. The hour matters. Streets were not yet filled with the normal business of the day. Fires in stoves, lamps, industrial spaces, and broken gas lines became dangerous in a city suddenly deprived of reliable control. People emerged into streets where the usual map of safety had changed. A brick building could be a hazard. A wooden structure could be kindling. A familiar street could be blocked. A hydrant could be useless. In the most basic sense, the earthquake was the trigger. It damaged buildings and infrastructure directly, and the physical losses from shaking alone were severe. But the larger destruction came through interaction. The National Park Service account identifies the central mechanism. Ruptured gas mains leaked fuel for fires, while ruptured water mains crippled the ability to fight them. That contradiction is one of the defining images of the disaster. San Francisco was surrounded by water, yet firefighters in many places lacked the water pressure and functioning mains needed to stop the flames in the streets before them. This is why the disaster cannot be understood as nature acting alone. The earth moved, but the city burned through its own broken networks. Its systems had been built to support urban growth, commerce, housing, and daily life. Under ordinary conditions, gas and water made the city more livable. Under earthquake conditions, damaged gas lines became a source of ignition and fuel, while damaged water lines removed the principal defense. What had made the city modern also made it vulnerable. The first chapter of this catastrophe, then, is not simply a scene of terror at dawn. It is a problem of cause and scale. Why did seconds of shaking become days of destruction? Why did a regional fault rupture become a defining American urban disaster? Why did rebuilding become not only a physical project, but a political struggle? The answers begin in the quiet before 512. San Francisco in 1906 was not a fragile frontier settlement. It was a major city, a commercial center, and a symbol of Western growth. It had banks, hotels, warehouses, newspapers, churches, theaters, and neighborhoods shaped by class, work, migration, and racial power. Chinatown stood in the city's core as a large Chinese community and as a target of political pressure. The waterfront connected San Francisco to trade. The financial district represented wealth and institutional confidence. The city looked permanent. But earthquakes reveal what permanence is made of. They expose whether a building rests on bedrock or on made ground. They show whether pipes can flex or snap. They test whether emergency plans are real or improvised. They uncover not only geology, but governance. In later accounting, the scale would become almost hard to hold in one frame. Modern United States Geological Survey summaries give more than 3,000 deaths as the estimate for the disaster. About 225,000 people were left homeless from a San Francisco population of about 400,000. The same source lists 28,188 buildings destroyed. The National Archives states that fires burned for 3 days and destroyed nearly 500 city blocks. Those figures belong to the full arc of what followed, but their roots were already present in the first minute. The fractured mains, the damaged buildings, the broken routines of command, and the urgent need to impose order on a shaken population all began before the city had taken its first ordinary breath of mourning. In a disaster, timing changes moral responsibility in complicated ways. No mayor, engineer, soldier, firefighter, or political boss caused the San Andreas Fault to rupture. The Earth's movement was not corrupt, not negligent, not ambitious. But what happened after the shaking entered the realm of human systems? Decisions had to be made under pressure. Where to fight fire, whether to destroy buildings to make fire breaks, how to house refugees, how to police the streets, how to distribute aid, and how to rebuild land whose value had suddenly become contested. Some choices were desperate. Some were organized. Some were damaging. Some would later appear as civic heroism, others as blunder, prejudice, or opportunity. The United States Army would manage most of the city's official refugee camps. Small wooden earthquake cottages would later replace tents for thousands of people who still had nowhere to go. Officials would attempt to permanently relocate Chinatown to Hunter's Point after the neighborhood was destroyed, a plan that failed only after resistance and changed circumstances. And beneath the public language of recovery, the city's graft politics would emerge through indictments involving Abraham Ruef, Mayor Eugene E. Schmitz, members of the Board of Supervisors, the police chief, and corporate officers of major utilities. That is where this story is going, but it begins with the first rupture of confidence. At 5:12 in the morning, San Francisco's residents could not know that their city would soon be read as a case study in earthquake science, urban fire, emergency relief, racial politics, and municipal corruption. They could not know that the disaster would help investigators understand how faults store and release strain. They could not know that the city's eventual display of recovery at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915 would become part of its public identity. They knew only the immediate fact. The ground had moved, and nothing around them felt certain. The earthquake made the city vulnerable. The fire made vulnerability visible from miles away. The response made it political. And the rebuilding made it a turning point. To understand why, we have to widen the frame beyond the streets of San Francisco before dawn and follow the break itself, north and south along the line where the ground gave way. The city was the symbol, but the fault was much larger than the city, and its rupture would define the scale of everything that followed. To widen the frame is to leave the city for a moment without leaving the disaster behind. San Francisco became the image people remembered: tilted walls, broken streets, smoke columns, refugees moving through public parks. But the earthquake itself was not a local accident beneath one city. It was a long failure along one of North America's great fault systems, a rupture that ran through Northern California on a scale difficult to hold in the mind. The line was the Northern San Andreas Fault. The United States Geological Survey describes the rupture of April 18, 1906, as extending about 296 miles, or 477 kilometers, along the northern San Andreas Fault. Its path ran from northwest of San Juan Bautista toward Cape Mendocino, near the region where major tectonic boundaries meet off the coast of Northern California. San Francisco stood close to this break and suffered terribly because of it, but the fault movement belonged to a much larger geography. It connected coastal hills, rural valleys, small towns, fences, roads, streams, and fields into one immense episode of ground displacement. That is one reason the event became so important to earthquake science. It was not only destructive, it was legible. The rupture left evidence across the landscape. Investigators could follow the fault trace and see where the ground had shifted. They could compare damage in different places. They could begin to connect what people felt in cities with what the Earth had done across hundreds of miles. A fault is not simply a crack waiting open in the ground. It is a boundary where blocks of the Earth's crust move past one another, usually too slowly for human senses to notice. Strain accumulates over time. Rock bends, locks, and resists. Then, when the stored stress exceeds the strength of the locked section, the fault slips. In 1906, that release came before dawn, and the movement was large enough to tear across Northern California. The San Andreas Fault is often discussed today as if it were a single line on a map, but a line on a map can make the process seem too clean. In reality, the rupture crossed a varied landscape. It passed near places where people lived and worked, and through country that was not urban at all. In some places, the evidence of motion could be measured in displaced fences or offset roads. In others, the evidence came through shaking, broken structures, and changed ground. The city's collapse and fire would dominate public memory, but the fault itself told a wider story. The earthquake was regional before it was urban. This distinction matters because the disaster has often been shortened into a San Francisco story. That is understandable. San Francisco was the largest symbol of destruction. It was the financial and cultural center whose burning was photographed, reported, and mourned. Yet the scientific event was the northern San Andreas rupture. The city was not the cause. It was one of the most exposed human systems sitting near the consequences. The length of the rupture also helps explain why the earthquake was so powerful. A longer rupture can release energy across a larger section of fault. That does not mean every place along the rupture experiences the same damage, or that distance alone determines destruction. Local geology, building materials, water systems, gas systems, firefighting capacity, and later emergency decisions all mattered. But the rupture length gives the event its geologic scale. It shows why what began as motion along a fault became a defining catastrophe for Northern California. It also brings us to the question of magnitude, a question that seems simple until the language changes over time. For many years, the 1906 earthquake was widely associated with a magnitude estimate of 8.3. That older figure still appears in many retellings, and it helped give the earthquake a reputation as one of the most severe events in American memory. But modern scientific summaries use more careful terminology. The United States Geological Survey commonly describes the event with a moment magnitude of about 7.9. Other studies have estimated a surface wave magnitude of 7.7. The older 8.3 estimate is no longer the preferred modern descriptor. That does not mean the earthquake has somehow become smaller in historical consequence. The buildings did not fall less violently because scientists revised the language. The fires did not burn fewer blocks. The homeless did not become less homeless. What changed was the way seismologists describe and compare earthquakes. Magnitude scales are tools, and tools have histories. Older estimates were based on the best available methods of their time. But as earthquake science developed, seismologists adopted measurements that better captured the physical size of large ruptures. Moment magnitude is tied to the seismic moment of an earthquake, which relates to the area of fault that slipped, the amount of slip, and the rigidity of the rocks involved. For large earthquakes, that kind of measurement is often more useful than older scale descriptions. So when we say the modern preferred language is moment magnitude about 7.9, we are not softening the disaster. We are locating it more accurately in the language of modern seismology. The number is a scientific description, not a moral ranking. The significance of 1906 comes from the fault rupture, the shaking, the fires, the broken infrastructure, the displacement, and the political aftermath together. Magnitude is one part of that story, not the whole of it. Still, the magnitude question matters because disasters are remembered through numbers. A time, a death toll, a dollar loss, a count of ruined buildings, a magnitude. Numbers become shorthand. They travel faster than explanations, but when the shorthand is outdated, it can distort what experts now believe. To call the event a moment magnitude 7.9 earthquake is to use the language that better fits current understanding while recognizing that the older 8.3 belongs to the history of interpretation. The 1906 rupture also changed more than public memory. It helped shape a foundational idea in earthquake science, elastic rebound theory. After the earthquake, Harry Fielding Reid studied displacement and strain associated with the event. The theory that emerged from that work explained earthquakes as the sudden release of elastic strain that had accumulated along a locked fault. In simple terms, the earth around the fault deforms gradually, storing energy, and then rebounds when the fault slips. That idea gave scientists a way to understand earthquakes not as isolated shocks from nowhere, but as part of a long mechanical process. The shaking before dawn was sudden to the people who felt it. It was not sudden to the rocks. The rupture was the release of strain built up over time. This is one of the quiet turning points inside the catastrophe. The same disaster that shattered buildings and exposed civic weakness also produced evidence that strengthened modern earthquake science. Surveying the fault was not an abstract exercise. It was an attempt to understand why the ground had moved as it did, why damage varied, and how future cities might think about risk. The map of the rupture widened responsibility. If the earthquake was not just a city event, then preparedness could not be only a matter of one downtown's buildings. If shaking varied by ground condition, then geology had to become part of urban planning. If faults stored strain over time, then earthquakes were not random punishments, but physical processes that could be studied, mapped, and anticipated, even if not precisely predicted. Along the northern San Andreas, the rupture made visible a relationship between deep geologic time and modern urban life. San Francisco had cable cars, brick buildings, wooden houses, gas mains, water mains, newspapers, banks, and a political machine. Beneath and around all of that was a fault system moving on its own schedule. The disaster came when those two realities met, a city built for commerce and expansion, and a landscape shaped by tectonic force. To understand the earthquake, then, we have to hold two scales at once. There is the human scale, rooms dark before sunrise, people thrown from beds, masonry cracking, streets filling with dust. And there is the fault scale, hundreds of miles of rupture, from northwest of San Juan Bautista toward Cape Mendocino, releasing stored strain along the northern San Andreas. The danger of focusing only on the larger scale is that people disappear. The danger of focusing only on the city is that the cause becomes too small. The earthquake was both intimate and immense. It entered bedrooms and shops, but it also crossed a region. It was felt by individuals as terror and by science as evidence. And soon, those two scales would meet in the duration of the shaking itself. For all the miles of rupture, for all the strain released along the fault, the strongest motion in San Francisco lasted less than a minute. A foreshock, a pause, and then roughly 45 to 60 seconds of violence were enough to damage the city, frighten a vast region, and begin the chain of failures that fire would turn into catastrophe. Less than a minute is a difficult measure to hold in the mind. It is shorter than a song verse, shorter than a city block walked at an ordinary pace, shorter than the time it takes for a household to move from sleep into understanding. Yet in San Francisco, on April 18, 1906, that was the interval in which the physical city was remade. There had been a foreshock first, then a brief pause. That pause mattered psychologically, even if it was only a moment. It offered the kind of false reassurance that disasters sometimes provide before they deepen. A person awakened by the first motion might have had just enough time to register confusion, to sit up, to call out, to listen. Then the main rupture arrived, and the distinction between a tremor and a catastrophe became unmistakable. The United States Geological Survey describes the strong shaking as lasting roughly 45 to 60 seconds. That range is modest in language and enormous in consequence. It does not sound long until it is imagined from inside a building, before dawn, when floors are moving, walls are cracking, chimneys are failing, and the world's most trusted reference points, ceiling, doorway, stair, street, no longer behave as fixed things. For San Francisco, the violence was not evenly translated into damage, and the reasons for that will matter deeply. But before we come to the question of ground conditions, it is worth staying with the time itself. 45 to 60 seconds was long enough for structures to be tested repeatedly, not by a single jolt, but by continuing motion. It was long enough for weak walls to fail, for masonry to loosen, for streets to fill with debris, and for residents to move from surprise into fear without yet knowing that the greater disaster would come from fire. This was one of the cruel features of the morning. In the first minute, the earthquake announced itself as the central event. It broke the city's confidence in the solidity beneath it. It damaged buildings and streets. It ruptured systems that were supposed to remain invisible when they worked. Gas mains, water mains, the buried networks that made modern urban life possible. But the shaking was also only the opening act. People living through those seconds could not yet know that broken gas lines would feed flames, or that broken water lines would cripple the fight against them. They experienced motion first. Meaning came later. The earthquake's reach was far larger than San Francisco. According to the United States Geological Survey, it was felt from southern Oregon to south of Los Angeles, and inland as far as central Nevada. That felt area tells us something important about scale. The city was the most famous victim, and for understandable reasons. It was densely built, economically important, and soon visibly burning. Its destruction would be photographed, described, debated, insured, investigated, and mythologized. But the shaking did not respect city boundaries, county lines, or the idea that a disaster belongs only to the place where the worst images are made. Across that broad region, people experienced the same event in different intensities. Far from San Francisco, the earthquake might have been a frightening disturbance, a shaking of beds, a rattling of windows, a story told at breakfast. Closer to the rupture and in vulnerable ground conditions, it became structural damage and bodily danger. The same fault movement connected these experiences, but it did not distribute harm equally. That distinction matters because earthquakes are often described by a single magnitude, as though one number contains the event. But lived experience depends on location, ground, building type, distance, and the ways a city has prepared or failed to prepare. A moment magnitude of about 7.9 gives scientists a way to describe the energy released by the rupture. It does not tell us what it felt like to hear brick fall in a dark street, or what it meant for a firefighter to discover later that the water system had failed, or why one neighborhood suffered differently from another. In San Francisco, the early hours shaped the human experience. The city was not fully awake. The routines of the day had not yet begun. Shops were not open in the ordinary way. Offices were not filled. Streets were not carrying the full motion of business. That timing may have kept some people away from the most dangerous places they might otherwise have occupied, but it also meant that many encountered the shaking in the vulnerability of sleep. The disaster entered private rooms before it became a public emergency. Imagine, without inventing any single witness beyond the record, the ordinary materials of the city being tested at once: wood framing, brick walls, glass, plaster, chimneys, cornices, pipes, rails, pavement. The earthquake did not need hours to expose weaknesses. It needed seconds. In that short interval, the built environment revealed the assumptions hidden inside it. Which walls had strength? Which connections held? Which ground moved more sharply? Which systems had redundancy, and which failed in ways that would multiply danger? This is why the duration deserves attention. A disaster measured in less than a minute can still become a disaster measured in days, years, and generations. The immediate shaking damaged buildings. The damage to buried infrastructure helped create the conditions for fire. The fire produced mass displacement. Displacement required camps, military management, temporary housing, and political decisions about who would return and where. Later, reconstruction would intersect with corruption investigations, racial geography, and a citywide performance of recovery. But all of that long aftermath began inside a very short window of motion. There is also a tension in how the event was understood afterward. To residents, it was fear and loss. To scientists, it became evidence. The same shaking that terrified people also left traces, patterns of damage, differences between neighborhoods, measurable offsets along the fault, and clues about how strain had been stored and released. The earthquake would help shape modern earthquake science, including Harry Fielding Reid's elastic rebound theory. But scientific understanding arrived after the danger. First came the body's knowledge. The ground can move. In San Francisco, the end of the strongest shaking did not mean safety. That is another reason the 45 to 60 seconds should not be mistaken for the full disaster. When the motion stopped, the city had to interpret what had happened while standing inside the consequences. Some buildings were damaged or destroyed. Streets were obstructed. Utility lines were broken. The morning was still young, and the fires that would define the catastrophe were only beginning their rise. The Felt Range, from southern Oregon to south of Los Angeles and inland to central Nevada, gives the earthquake its geographic scale. The minute in San Francisco gives it human scale. Held together, those two facts prevent two common misunderstandings. The first is to imagine the disaster as only a city tragedy, disconnected from a major rupture of the northern San Andreas Fault. The second is to imagine it only as a geologic event, so large that individual experience disappears. The truth is more difficult and more revealing. A vast fault moved, and people woke in darkness to the sound of their city breaking. Even within San Francisco, the shaking did not write the same sentence everywhere. Some places were more vulnerable, not simply because of what had been built, but because of what lay beneath what had been built. The earthquake's force passed through different kinds of ground, and the ground changed the message. Sediment-filled valleys, made land, reclaimed ground, and firmer bedrock did not respond in identical ways. The city's destruction was therefore not only a story of magnitude or duration. It was a story of location. That is where the brief interval of shaking begins to widen again. 45 to 60 seconds was enough to reveal that an urban map is also a geologic map, whether its residents know it or not. Streets may look continuous. Buildings may share the same skyline. But beneath them, the materials differ, and in an earthquake, those differences become consequential. The first minute showed the power of the rupture. The pattern of damage would show something just as important. The ground itself had helped decide what San Francisco would lose. The pattern of damage would show something just as important. The ground itself had helped decide what San Francisco would lose. To someone walking the city before dawn on April 18th, 1906, the streets may have appeared to belong to one continuous place. A block of homes, a commercial street, a warehouse district, a waterfront edge. But an earthquake does not read a city the way its residents do. It does not follow property lines, political boundaries, or the names printed on maps. It moves through materials. That distinction mattered in San Francisco. The shaking came from the rupture of the northern San Andreas Fault, but the violence that people experienced at the surface was shaped by what lay between the fault's released energy and the buildings above. Some parts of the city rested on firmer ground. Others had been built over sediment-filled valleys or on made and reclaimed ground where the surface itself had been assembled, filled, or extended for urban use. The difference was not abstract. Areas built on those softer or altered materials suffered stronger shaking than nearby sites on bedrock. This was one of the earthquake's quieter lessons, but also one of its most durable. It meant that damage could not be explained only by distance from the fault, or by the size of the earthquake, or even by the quality of construction. Those factors mattered, but they did not act alone. The same regional earthquake could pass through one kind of ground and emerge with one destructive character, then pass through another and produce something worse. In a city, that difference could be measured in cracked walls, collapsed structures, broken pipes, impassable streets, and neighborhoods made far more vulnerable to what came afterward. The phrase "made ground" sounds almost harmless. It suggests improvement, engineering, progress. Cities often grow by remaking shorelines, filling low places, and converting land that once served one purpose into land that can support another. In San Francisco, as in other expanding urban places, the built environment had pushed into areas where the natural ground had been changed. Reclaimed ground was a promise that the city could enlarge itself. Sediment-filled valleys offered usable space, routes, and building sites. But the earthquake revealed that all ground is not equal simply because a street has been laid across it. This did not mean that every building on firmer ground survived, or that every building on softer ground failed. Earthquake damage is never that simple. Building materials, design, age, maintenance, and fire exposure all shaped the final map of ruin. But the broad pattern was clear enough to matter. Where the surface materials were less firm, the shaking could be amplified. Nearby bedrock sites could experience the same earthquake with less severe motion. In other words, Two places close together in the city could occupy different seismic realities. That insight changed the meaning of an urban map. A map of streets tells people where to go. A map of ownership tells who controls land. A political map tells which authorities claim responsibility. But after 1906, scientists and planners had reason to see another map underneath all of these, a map of ground conditions. Sediment, fill, reclaimed land, and bedrock were not merely geological descriptions. They were risk factors. The importance of this became clearer because the disaster was studied systematically. The 1906 earthquake became foundational for modern earthquake science in more than one way. It helped Harry Fielding Reid develop elastic rebound theory, a model for understanding how strain accumulates along a fault and is released during rupture. But the earthquake also forced attention toward the surface, toward the way local ground conditions shaped destruction in real neighborhoods. Fault mechanics explained where the energy came from. Local geology helped explain why damage varied from place to place. That second lesson was especially important for cities. A wilderness earthquake can scar hillsides, offset fences, and shift streams, but an urban earthquake tests the entire human system built on top of the ground. It tests foundations, masonry, roads, water mains, gas lines, hospitals, warehouses, and housing. If certain ground conditions intensify shaking, then the risk is not spread evenly across the city. It is concentrated, sometimes in places where people have built densely, invested heavily, or placed essential infrastructure. This is why the pattern in San Francisco later informed seismic zonation practice. Seismic zonation is based on the recognition that earthquake hazard is not only regional, it is local. The question is not simply, is this city near a fault? It is also, what kind of ground is this part of the city built on? The 1906 disaster made that question harder to ignore. A city could no longer be understood as one uniform surface exposed to one uniform danger. It had to be understood as a set of districts, each with its own relationship between geology and construction. That was a turning point in how urban earthquake risk was imagined. Before the disaster, people could see the confidence of a growing city in its buildings and streets. Afterward, the same streets could be read as evidence of choices, where land had been filled, where valleys had been built over, where waterfront expansion had created usable property, where bedrock offered a different foundation. The earthquake did not create those differences. It exposed them. There is a moral danger, though, in describing destruction this way. If we say that the ground mattered, it can sound as though the disaster was simply natural, as though geology alone decided the outcome. But that is not the full lesson. Geology shaped the shaking. Human decisions shaped exposure. People chose where to build, what to build with, how to extend the city, where to place pipes and streets, and how much to understand about the materials beneath them. The disaster sits at the meeting point of natural process and urban decision. That meeting point is central to the story of San Francisco. The city was not destroyed because one cause acted alone. The fault rupture was essential. The duration of strong shaking was essential. But the distribution of damage reflected the city's own ground conditions. Then, almost immediately, the damaged city became vulnerable to other failures. Broken structures were one part of the crisis. Broken systems would become another. The geology lesson also helps explain why the earthquake's consequences did not end when the shaking stopped. If softer or reclaimed ground intensified motion, then the infrastructure crossing those areas was also at greater risk. Pipes, mains, and urban networks are only as secure as the ground that carries them and the joints that hold them together under stress. When the earthquake moved through the city, it did not damage isolated objects. It disturbed connected systems. A break in one place could weaken the ability to respond somewhere else. That connection between local ground and citywide consequence is one of the disaster's most important themes. A neighborhood might experience strong shaking because of the material beneath it. A pipe might rupture there. A fire might begin or spread because a gas line failed. Firefighters might arrive and discover that the water system, damaged elsewhere or nearby, could not deliver what they needed. In that sequence, geology becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure becomes fate. The earthquake's scientific legacy, then, was not only about understanding the San Andreas Fault as a great source of seismic energy. It was also about understanding that the surface of a city is deceptive. Pavement hides sediment. Buildings hide fill. Street grids hide old valleys and reclaimed margins. But in an earthquake, the hidden ground returns to public view. It does so through damage. For planners and scientists, this was a hard-earned lesson. The study of earthquake risk had to include the places where people actually live, not just the fault lines that generate the shaking. Bedrock, sediment-filled valleys, made land, and reclaimed ground became part of the practical vocabulary of urban safety. The disaster showed that the question of where a building stands can be as important as the question of how strongly the earth has shaken. In San Francisco, that knowledge arrived through ruin. The city's streets had looked continuous before dawn. Afterward, the damage map told a more complicated story. The earthquake had moved through the whole city, but not through the same ground everywhere. Some districts received the blow through firmer material. Others received it through ground more capable of intensifying the motion. The result was not random destruction, but destruction shaped by geology. And yet, even this was still only the first stage. The ground had helped determine where the city was most damaged. The shaking had cracked walls, twisted streets, and broken the hidden networks underfoot. But the catastrophe that would define San Francisco in memory was about to become visible above the skyline. Beneath the streets, gas and water systems had been wounded. One would feed flames. The other would fail, the people trying to fight them. Beneath the streets, the earthquake had done a second kind of damage, less visible at first than fallen walls or twisted rails, but more decisive for what came next. San Francisco's buildings had been struck from below. So had its systems. The pipes that carried gas through the city and the pipes that carried water to hydrants and households had been broken by the same motion that tore masonry and opened pavement. In that combination, the disaster changed form. The earthquake had lasted less than a minute. Fire would make the emergency last for days. The National Park Service describes the central mechanism plainly. Ruptured gas mains fed fires, while ruptured water mains crippled the effort to put them out. That sentence contains the terrible logic of the morning. One network supplied fuel. Another network removed resistance. The city did not simply catch fire because flames appeared after an earthquake. It burned because the earthquake had damaged the very urban machinery meant to keep fire ordinary, local, and containable. In a city, fire is always a possibility. Stoves, lamps, furnaces, chimneys, commercial kitchens, workshops, and industrial sites all carry some risk. Before dawn on April 18, 1906, San Francisco was full of those everyday hazards, embedded in a dense urban fabric of wood buildings, brick buildings, warehouses, hotels, shops, homes, and offices. Under normal conditions, a fire might begin in one room, one kitchen, one shop, one block. It might be reported. Engines might arrive. Hydrants might be opened. Water pressure might turn a private accident into a public response. But after the shaking, the ordinary sequence failed. Gas escaped where pipes had been torn apart. Flames could find that gas and grow stronger. At the same time, firefighters faced a city in which water, though physically near, was often functionally absent. San Francisco sat on a peninsula, surrounded by bay and ocean, but the water that mattered in the first hours was not the water visible from the hills or the waterfront. It was the water inside mains, under pressure, carried through streets to hydrants. That system had been wounded underground. This is one of the defining contradictions of the disaster. San Francisco was not a city in a desert. It was bordered by water. Ships moved through its harbor. The bay lay beside it. The Pacific lay beyond it. Yet in the burning districts, firefighters could be nearly powerless because the city's engineered access to water had failed. Water surrounded San Francisco, but broken pipes left it out of reach. That contradiction is important because it shows why the fire was not merely a natural aftershock of the earthquake. It was an infrastructure disaster. The fault rupture broke the ground. The city's dependence on hidden networks turned that break into cascading failure. The same streets that had appeared continuous before the earthquake concealed systems that only became visible when they stopped working. Gas was no longer safely contained. Water was no longer reliably delivered. The city's interior order had been broken open. The first fires did not need to be large to matter. In a damaged city, a small fire could become a moving front. Buildings had already been weakened. Streets were obstructed. Communications were disrupted. People were injured, disoriented, or trying to escape from damaged structures. Firefighters were not entering a normal urban emergency. They were entering a landscape produced by the earthquake itself. Debris, broken pavement, unstable walls, leaking gas, damaged mains, and frightened residents moving through streets that no longer behaved like streets. As flames spread, the disaster became more visible. Smoke began to mark places where the earthquake's underground damage had found expression above the roofs. Fire turned hidden failures into public spectacle. It rose where people could see it, smell it, flee from it. The shaking had been an interval of terror and noise. The fire became a process, an advancing condition, something that could be watched approaching and still not be stopped. By noon on April 18th, according to the National Park Service account, the financial district was in flames. That fact matters not only because of the district's wealth or architecture, but because it shows the speed with which the emergency moved from scattered post-earthquake fires toward a broader urban crisis. The financial district represented concentration, offices, records, commercial power, buildings tied to the city's role as a Pacific port and business center. When it burned, the fire was not just consuming structures. It was attacking the city's administrative and economic memory. But the flames did not remain confined to a symbolic core. They moved through districts already made vulnerable by the earthquake's uneven damage. Wood buildings and brick buildings alike stood in the path of fire. A building did not need to have collapsed to be at risk. It only needed to stand where flames could reach it, where fire crews lacked water, where gas leaks made ignition easier, or where debris and damage slowed response. The city's survival depended on interruption. A functioning hydrant, a cleared street, a defensible break, a line where firefighters could hold. Again and again, those ordinary forms of interruption were missing. The absence of water changed the meaning of firefighting labor. Firefighters could arrive and still be unable to fight in the way they had been trained to fight. They could identify danger, organize crews, move equipment, and face heat, but without reliable water pressure, the fundamental tool of urban fire suppression was gone. The problem was not courage. It was capacity. The city had people willing to respond, but their response depended on systems damaged beyond their immediate control. This is why the San Francisco fire cannot be understood as an accidental second chapter after the earthquake. It was born from the earthquake and then governed by the condition of the city the earthquake left behind. Broken gas mains made the environment more combustible. Broken water mains made suppression far harder. Damaged streets and buildings complicated movement. The fire expanded through a city whose defenses had been shaken loose before the first major flame front had fully gathered. By evening on April 18th, the National Park Service account says the city center had been incinerated. In less than a day, the disaster had crossed a threshold. What began as geological violence before dawn had become an urban firestorm by nightfall. The transformation was so complete that later memory often sees the earthquake and the fire together, almost as one event. But the distinction matters. The earthquake broke the city open. The fire consumed what the broken city could no longer protect. There is also a moral and political meaning in this sequence, though it would become clearer later. Infrastructure is not neutral when it fails. The arrangement of pipes, pressure, streets, buildings, and emergency authority determines who can be defended, how quickly help can arrive, and which parts of a city can be saved. On April 18th, those systems were not abstract. They were the difference between a building that might have been saved and one that burned, between a fire that might have been contained and one that became part of a citywide catastrophe. For residents on the ground, the explanation would not have arrived as a neat chain of causes. They would have seen smoke, heard alarms, felt heat, watched crowds moving, and understood only gradually that the danger was not ending with the earthquake. The disaster was extending itself. The city had survived the shaking in pieces, but those pieces now stood in the path of fire. And still, San Francisco was not without action. Officials, soldiers, firefighters, and residents searched for ways to stop the advance. If water could not be relied upon, another method would be tried. Buildings themselves might be sacrificed to create space that flames could not cross. In the logic of that desperate morning and afternoon, destruction began to look like a tool of rescue. The city had started to burn, and soon men with explosives would try to fight fire by making ruins ahead of it. The city had started to burn, and soon men with explosives would try to fight fire by making ruins ahead of it. The idea had a hard logic. If flames could not be drowned, perhaps they could be starved. A fire needs fuel. In a dense city, that fuel was not only wood, paper, furniture, and roofing. It was the city itself. Walls, floors, shops, hotels, warehouses, and the narrow spaces between buildings where heat could move from one structure to the next. To stop a fire without water, officials and soldiers looked for a way to remove that fuel before the flames arrived. They would blow up selected buildings and hope the empty space left behind would become a fire break. A fire break is simple in theory. It is a gap wide enough to deny a fire its next step. Forests can be cut. Brush can be cleared. In a city, the equivalent is more brutal. Buildings must be torn down, and in San Francisco on April 18, 1906, there was no time for careful demolition. The earthquake had already injured the city's water system. Fires were spreading from the damage. The ordinary instruments of urban firefighting were weakened at the exact moment they were most needed. So an extraordinary instrument entered the streets: dynamite. The National Park Service account of the disaster describes artillery troops from Fort Miley attempting to stop the fires by dynamiting buildings. Fort Miley stood on the western side of San Francisco, part of the military landscape that also included the Presidio. In the emergency after the earthquake, military force became part of the city's response, not only through order and relief, but through direct physical intervention in the burning city. Artillery troops were trained to handle force, explosives, and disciplined action. In the ruined streets, that training was redirected toward a civilian disaster. But a city is not an artillery range. It is crowded, irregular, full of hidden connections and partial collapses. It contains gas lines, walls already cracked by shaking, combustible interiors, and streets crowded with people trying to escape or save what they can. To use explosives in such a place was to add one violent technology to the aftermath of another. The earthquake had broken the city open from below. Dynamite would now break it open from within. The decision was not irrational. It belonged to a morning when normal choices had narrowed. Firefighters without reliable water faced a kind of helplessness that must have seemed intolerable. Flames were not waiting for administrative clarity. Smoke columns marked the spread of danger. The city's leaders and responders needed action that could be taken immediately, with the materials and personnel available. Dynamiting buildings offered an answer that was direct, visible, and forceful. Yet the same qualities that made it attractive also made it dangerous. A building destroyed by explosives does not simply vanish. It can become a pile of splintered wood, broken beams, shattered brick, and scattered contents. If the demolition is not complete, if the gap is not wide enough, or if burning debris is thrown into surrounding structures, the attempted firebreak can fail. The National Park Service states plainly that these early efforts were unsuccessful. That sentence matters because it changes how we understand the disaster. The destruction was not only something that happened to San Francisco. Some of it was done in the hope of saving San Francisco. This is one of the most difficult aspects of emergency history. Decisions made under pressure are often judged later by their results, but they were made in a moment when results could not be known. The men placing explosives were not trying to enlarge the catastrophe. They were trying to interrupt it. They were working in a city where gas had fed fires and water mains had failed. They were responding to a danger that moved faster than institutions could think. Still, the record shows that the method did not achieve what was hoped in those first attempts. The failure of early dynamiting also reveals a deeper problem. San Francisco's fire disaster was not a single line of flame that could be neatly cut off at one point. It was a crisis rooted in systems. The earthquake had damaged infrastructure across the urban fabric. Fires appeared and spread in a city whose protective networks had been compromised. A fire break might stop a particular front if placed correctly, built wide enough, and supported by other firefighting resources. But in San Francisco, the problem was broader than one front. Broken mains meant that even when responders made a stand, they often lacked water to hold it. In that setting, dynamite became both tool and symbol. It symbolized determination, the refusal to let the fire advance without resistance. It also symbolized improvisation under collapse. The city had entered a zone where the boundary between rescue and ruin became unstable. A building might be destroyed to save a block. A block might be sacrificed to save a district. But if the plan failed, the sacrifice structures simply joined the total loss. There is a temptation, looking backward, to treat such actions as errors made by people who should have known better. But that is too easy. The more useful lesson is quieter and more unsettling. Disasters force decisions before knowledge is complete. The responders in San Francisco had to act amid smoke, damaged streets, unreliable communications, failed water supplies, and spreading fire. Their improvisation was not separate from the catastrophe. It was part of how the catastrophe unfolded. The presence of artillery troops from Fort Miley also points to the role of the military in the city's emergency life. Soldiers were not merely a distant federal resource. They became visible actors in the streets, bringing organization, manpower, and, in this case, explosives. The same institutional capacity that could impose order or build camps could also be used to tear down parts of the city in the name of survival. That dual role would remain important in the days that followed, as San Francisco moved from firefighting to relief, displacement, and camp administration. For the people watching buildings blown apart, the scene must have complicated the meaning of safety. The earthquake had made buildings fall. Fire was consuming others. Now official action was destroying still more. A resident could understand the purpose and still feel the shock of it. The city was being defended by being dismantled. The sound of explosions, after the sound of shaking, would have reinforced a terrifying impression. The disaster had not passed into recovery. It was still actively remaking the city. The early failure of dynamiting did not mean that every idea behind fire breaks was foolish. It meant that emergency technique depends on timing, conditions, coordination, and the physical realities of the place where it is used. In a city of damaged infrastructure and spreading ignition, a dramatic measure could be overwhelmed by the larger mechanics of the fire. Explosives could remove buildings. They could not restore the water mains. They could not undo ruptured gas lines. They could not make a dense city suddenly easy to defend. This is why the story of Dynamite belongs at the center of the San Francisco disaster, not as a side episode. It shows the transition from natural event to human-managed catastrophe. The earthquake began with a fault rupture beyond human control. But the days that followed were shaped by choices: where to fight, what to sacrifice, who had authority, what tools were available, and how much risk responders were willing to add in order to prevent greater loss. Dynamiting buildings was one of those choices, born from urgency and limited options. By the end of that first day, the limits of such improvisation were becoming clear. The fire was not contained by the early explosions. It continued to move through the city's core. The National Park Service account places the financial district in flames by noon on April 18th, and by evening, the city center had been incinerated. The effort to create emptiness ahead of the fire had not been enough. Instead of a clean break between safety and destruction, San Francisco faced a widening burned district, block after block, drawn into the same advancing disaster. The Dynamite campaign leaves behind a hard image: men trying to save a city by destroying pieces of it, while fire crossed the gaps they made. It is an image of courage, confusion, and consequence at once. The earthquake had shaken the ground for less than a minute, but the emergency it created now demanded decisions hour after hour. Some decisions helped, some failed. Some added new damage in the attempt to prevent worse. And all the while, the flames kept finding fuel. What had begun before dawn as a rupture in the earth was becoming a 3-day urban firestorm. The scale was no longer measured only in broken pipes or isolated fires, but in districts, business streets, civic landmarks, and the widening geography of loss. By the time the fires had run their course, the numbers would be almost impossible to hold in the mind. Nearly 500 city blocks destroyed, and a burned area measured in square miles. But before those figures could be counted, San Francisco had to pass through the long hours when every failed barrier meant the fire had found another way forward. Every failed barrier meant the fire had found another way forward. That was the rhythm of San Francisco after the shaking stopped. A line drawn, a building sacrificed, a hope that open space might interrupt the flames, and then the discovery that wind, heat, fuel, and broken water systems had their own momentum. By noon on April 18th, 1906, the disaster had crossed a threshold. According to the National Park Service account, the financial district was in flames by midday. This mattered not only because of what stood there, but because of what the district represented. The financial district was one of the city's centers of business, record-keeping, investment, insurance, and daily exchange. It was where the modern city stored some of its confidence in paper, offices, banks, ledgers, and commercial buildings. When fire entered that district, San Francisco was not only losing structures, it was losing the machinery through which a city measured property, credit, contracts, and recovery. The earthquake had lasted less than a minute. The fire was teaching the city a different scale of time. It moved through hours, then through the entire day, then into the night. People who had survived the first shock now watched a slower disaster advance, street by street. A wall might stand for a while and then glow from within. A building might seem safe until heat reached its roof or windows. Streets that had been familiar routes through the city became edges of danger, then vanished into smoke. By evening, the National Park Service account says the city center had been incinerated. That word carries a terrible finality. It does not describe a single building fallen or a single block damaged. It describes an urban core consumed. The morning had begun with broken ground, broken mains, and scattered fires. By nightfall, much of the central city had become a burned landscape, with heat still active and new fronts still forming. This is one reason the San Francisco earthquake cannot be understood as only a seismic event. The rupture along the northern San Andreas Fault began the catastrophe, but the city's destruction unfolded in the systems that failed after the shaking. Fire turned the disaster from an episode of violent motion into an extended siege. It forced residents to live through uncertainty after the earthquake itself had ended. The first question had been whether buildings would stand. The next question was whether anything around them could be saved. The fires burned for 3 days. The National Archives gives the scale in a stark figure: nearly 500 city blocks destroyed. That number is difficult to imagine because a city block is a human unit. It is the distance between one crossing and another, the size of a neighborhood errand, the frontage of shops, hotels, homes, offices, warehouses, churches, and small rooms above storefronts. Nearly 500 of those blocks means destruction at the scale of ordinary life, repeated again and again, until the repetition becomes nearly abstract. The United States Geological Survey, drawing on a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration report, refers to a burned district of 4.7 square miles. That measurement gives the disaster another kind of scale. A square mile is not how most people experience a city, but it is how officials, engineers, insurers, and historians begin to measure catastrophe after the fact. 4.7 square miles means that the fire had become geographic. It was no longer an event at an address. It was a district, a scar across the map. The difference between these two ways of counting, nearly 500 blocks and 4.7 square miles, is important. Blocks tell us about the city as people moved through it. Square miles tell us about the city as a burn zone. Together, they show how the fire translated daily San Francisco into an expanse of ruin. The disaster could be walked, but it could also be mapped. It could be remembered by a person who lost a room, a shop, or a street corner. It could also be recorded by agencies trying to understand the largest pattern. During those 3 days, the city's density became part of its vulnerability. The fire did not need to leap across empty country. It could feed on the built environment itself. Wood buildings, brick buildings, contents, roofs, commercial interiors, and the material life of a busy port city all became fuel. Earlier attempts to make fire breaks with explosives had shown how desperate the situation had become. But once the central city was burning, the question was no longer simply whether one tactical line could hold. It was whether any combination of human effort, broken infrastructure, and improvised destruction could contain a fire that had already found so many paths. The image of San Francisco surrounded by water remains one of the central contradictions of the disaster. The bay and the ocean were near, but the urban system that made water useful had been damaged. Firefighting in a modern city depends not only on water's existence, but on pressure, pipes, hydrants, access, and coordination. When mains rupture, water becomes present in theory and absent in practice. Firefighters could see what needed to be done. The city's wounded infrastructure made doing it almost impossible in many places. This is why the fire's duration matters. 3 days is long enough for shock to become exhaustion. It is long enough for people to move more than once, carrying what they can, abandoning what they cannot, and recalculating safety as the flames shift. It is long enough for officials to make decisions under pressure, for rumors to travel, for streets to clog, for smoke to alter the sense of direction and time. It is long enough for a city to understand that the earthquake was not the end of the disaster, but the beginning of a chain. By the time the fires had burned out, the destruction had reached a scale that would shape every later argument about San Francisco's future. Relief, rebuilding, insurance, public authority, private loss, racial politics, and corruption would all unfold over the ground that fire had cleared. The burned district was not empty in any simple sense. It was full of claims by owners, tenants, businesses, city officials, relief agencies, insurers, politicians, and displaced families. The fire had erased buildings, but it had not erased competing interests. In some ways, it made them more urgent. The numbers that survive from the firestorm are therefore not just statistics. Nearly 500 city blocks destroyed tells us how far the flames traveled through lived space. 4.7 square miles tells us how large the burned district became in the official record. 3 days tells us how long San Francisco remained under assault after the earth itself had stopped moving. Noon and evening on April 18th marked the acceleration. By midday, the financial district was burning. By night, the city center had been incinerated. What followed would require another kind of accounting. Once the flames no longer advanced, San Francisco had to count the dead, the homeless, and the buildings lost. Those figures would be contested, revised, and remembered unevenly. But the physical stage for that reckoning had already been set. A city center burned out, nearly 500 blocks gone, and a population forced to confront the difference between surviving the earthquake and surviving the disaster it had unleashed. Once the flames no longer advanced, San Francisco faced a quieter task, and in some ways, a more difficult one. The city had to turn catastrophe into numbers. It had to count bodies, list missing people, estimate the homeless, separate damaged buildings from destroyed ones, and attach money values to streets that had become ash. This was not only bookkeeping. It was the first struggle over what the disaster meant. The figures that survive from 1906 do not speak with one voice. Early official counts were much lower than the estimates used today. That difference matters because a death toll is never just a statistic. It reflects what authorities were able to see, whom they chose to count, how records survived, and how quickly a damaged city wanted to move from shock into recovery. In the immediate aftermath, San Francisco had reasons to compress its losses into a manageable story. A city trying to attract capital, settle insurance claims, and rebuild confidence did not necessarily benefit from emphasizing the full scale of death. Modern summaries from the United States Geological Survey give the more widely accepted estimate, more than 3,000 deaths from the earthquake and fire. That number places the disaster among the deadliest in United States history. It also changes the emotional scale of the event. If one imagines the earthquake only as a minute of shaking, the number is already terrible. But if one remembers the fires that followed, the broken water system, the collapsing buildings, the smoke-filled streets, and the days of displacement, the death toll becomes part of a larger sequence. People died in the earthquake, in the fires, and in the collapse of the systems that should have helped protect them. Counting the dead was hard because San Francisco itself had become difficult to read. The fire consumed records, along with buildings. It destroyed homes where names, addresses, and family papers might have helped confirm who was missing. It scattered residents across parks, military reservations, vacant land, and surrounding communities. Some bodies could not be recovered in any ordinary way. Some people had no one immediately able to report them missing. Others lived in communities that city authorities did not always document with care or equality. The gap between earlier official totals and modern estimates is a reminder that disasters leave administrative shadows as well as physical ruins. The United States Geological Survey also gives another number that helps explain the human emergency after the fire. About 225,000 people were homeless out of a San Francisco population of about 400,000. More than half the city had lost shelter. This was not a small class of the unlucky pushed to the margins of an otherwise functioning place. Homelessness became a central condition of the city itself. That proportion is difficult to absorb. It means that the disaster did not simply damage buildings. It displaced the social body of San Francisco. Families who had been asleep before dawn on April 18, 1906, found themselves separated from kitchens, clothing, tools, workplaces, savings, and neighborhood networks. A home is not only a roof. It is storage, identity, routine, and security. When the fire took houses, hotels, rooming houses, and apartment buildings, it removed the ordinary framework through which people know what to do next. The destruction of buildings gives that displacement its physical outline. The United States Geological Survey lists 28,188 buildings destroyed. Within that count were 24,671 wood buildings and 3,168 brick buildings. The materials matter. San Francisco was a city of wood as well as masonry, and fire moved through wood with terrible efficiency. Brick, which might suggest permanence, did not guarantee survival in an earthquake followed by a citywide fire. In the burn district, construction type, street pattern, contents, and exposure to flame all became part of the outcome. Those destroyed buildings had held nearly every kind of urban life. They included places of work, places of worship, private rooms, offices, storage spaces, shops, warehouses, and lodging houses. When they disappeared, the loss was not measured only in walls and roofs. It was measured in jobs interrupted, businesses erased, tools gone, ledgers burned, and rents no longer attached to standing structures. The ruins were personal, commercial, and civic at the same time. The financial estimates carried the same layered meaning. The United States Geological Survey cites estimated property damage of more than $400 million in 1906 from earthquake and fire combined, with about $80 million attributed to the earthquake alone. The distinction between earthquake and fire damage was not merely technical. It had consequences for insurance, liability, and recovery. Policies could depend on cause. A building cracked by shaking and then consumed by flame became part of an argument about where the earthquake ended and where the fire began. That line was often hard to draw because the disaster itself had no clean boundary. The shaking broke gas mains and water mains. The broken gas system helped feed fires. The broken water system made firefighting far more difficult. Flames then destroyed buildings already weakened or exposed by the earthquake. For survivors, it may have seemed artificial to separate one cause from another. For insurers, officials, property owners, and courts, the distinction could determine who was paid, who was ruined, and how rebuilding would be financed. This is why the numbers matter beyond their size. More than 3,000 dead, about 225,000 homeless, 28,188 buildings destroyed, more than $400 million in property damage from earthquake and fire combined. Each figure describes a different layer of the same event. One is human loss. One is displacement. One is the removal of the built environment. One is the translation of destruction into money, contracts, and claims. But none of these figures should make the disaster feel orderly. Numbers can create the illusion that the past has been contained. In reality, the act of counting came after confusion, smoke, fear, and movement. People were searching for relatives. Officials were trying to restore command. Relief workers were trying to identify need. The city's business leadership was already thinking about reconstruction. Meanwhile, thousands of residents were living outdoors or in temporary shelter, carrying what they could, waiting for food, water, information, and permission to return where return was possible. The count of the homeless points directly toward the next phase of the disaster. Once the fire stopped, San Francisco did not become a city at peace. It became a city of refugees. The problem was no longer only how to extinguish flames or measure ruins. It was how to house, feed, supervise, and organize a displaced population larger than many American cities of the time. The answer that emerged was shaped by emergency power. Public spaces, military sites, and open land became places of refuge. The United States Army took on a central role in managing official camps, and military order entered the daily life of civilian survivors. The city that had just lost streets, homes, and landmarks began to rebuild temporary order in rows of tents, numbered spaces, and camp rules. Before permanent reconstruction could be celebrated, San Francisco had to live inside a system of displacement. The city that had just lost homes by the tens of thousands now had to become something else, a city of temporary shelter. The fires had erased neighborhoods, but they had not erased the people who depended on them. Survivors needed food, water, sanitation, medical care, and a place to sleep. They also needed order because displacement on this scale could not be handled as a private household problem. It became a public system. In San Francisco after the earthquake and fire of April 18, 1906, that system was shaped in large part by the United States Army. The Army did not manage every refuge in the city, but it managed most of the official ones. Of San Francisco's 26 official refugee camps, the Army managed 21. That fact is important because it tells us what recovery looked like before it became brick, timber, insurance settlements, and new construction. For thousands of people, recovery first meant living under military organization. The Army presence was not an abstraction. San Francisco already had important military sites, and some of them became part of the relief geography. The Presidio of San Francisco, long established on the northern edge of the city, near the Golden Gate, became one of the major places where refugees were housed. 4 refugee camps were located at the Presidio. These included camp areas associated with Fort Point and Letterman Hospital, and one isolated camp for refugees from Chinatown. That last detail carries more weight than it may first seem to. The disaster did not fall on a city where all residents held the same power. Chinese residents had already faced exclusion, segregation, and political hostility before the earthquake. After Chinatown was destroyed, the official handling of Chinese refugees reflected that unequal landscape. The presence of an isolated camp for refugees from Chinatown at the Presidio shows that the refugee system was not only about shelter. It was also about classification, supervision, and the boundaries drawn around different communities. The camps were meant to impose order on emergency life. In the official refugee system, tents were not simply scattered wherever space could be found. At the Presidio, the camps used a street grid arrangement. Tents were numbered. Directories were placed at corners. This was a city trying to reproduce the logic of streets after its streets had failed so many of its residents. The numbering of tents made people locatatable. The directories made the camp readable. The grid turned emergency shelter into an administrative map. There is a quiet significance in that arrangement. The fire had transformed homes, businesses, and landmarks into ruins that could not easily be navigated by memory. A person who once gave an address on a familiar street might now be known by a tent number in a camp. The corner directory replaced, in temporary form, the city directory, the storefront sign, the remembered route to a neighbor's door. This was not permanent recovery. It was a way of making displacement manageable. Army order also meant that relief was not only compassionate, it was supervised. Camps required rules. They required distribution systems. They required decisions about who belonged where, which spaces would be used, and how daily life would be arranged when private dwellings had disappeared. In a disaster that had left about 225,000 people homeless from a San Francisco population of about 400,000, such organization was not optional. The scale was too large for improvised charity alone. But military order carried its own meaning. Civilian survivors were living in a city where emergency authority had entered ordinary life. The same institution that had been visible during the fire, when troops and military resources were part of the emergency response, now remained present in the slower crisis of shelter. The disaster had moved from shaking to fire to homelessness, and at each stage the boundary between civil government and military control became more complicated. The official camps were only one part of a wider landscape of displacement, but they gave shape to the public response. Open land, military reservations, parks, and other available spaces became places where the city's population could be temporarily gathered and counted. The practical needs were basic, but the administrative challenge was enormous. People had to be housed in groups. Supplies had to be delivered. Sanitation had to be maintained. Illness had to be prevented. Families and individuals had to be placed into a system that officials could oversee. The use of a grid made sense in that context. It made a camp legible to the people running it and to the people living inside it. A numbered tent could be assigned, checked, supplied, or inspected. A corner directory could help someone find a relative, a relief worker locate a household, or an administrator keep records. These details may sound modest, but they reveal the first architecture of recovery. Before new neighborhoods rose, before earthquake cottages appeared in rows, Before rebuilding could be declared successful, the city had to create temporary order from canvas, numbering, and open ground. At the Presidio, the setting itself underscored the nature of the emergency. This was not the dense commercial and residential fabric that had burned. It was a military landscape, adapted to civilian need. Refugees who had been driven from the urban core were now living under an institution built for command, discipline, and logistics. The arrangement was practical, but it also changed the experience of being homeless. Shelter came with placement. Relief came with supervision. The official camp system also reminds us that disaster recovery is not only measured by the speed of rebuilding downtown. A city may raise new walls while many of its residents still live in temporary quarters. A skyline can begin to recover before households do. In San Francisco, the burned district would become a symbol of destruction and then of reconstruction. But the camps show another timeline, the timeline of people waiting for stable shelter. This is why the refugee crisis belongs at the center of the story, not at its edge. The earthquake and fire destroyed property on a vast scale, but the human consequence of that destruction was prolonged displacement. The homeless population was not a temporary footnote to the disaster. It was one of the disaster's defining facts. The official camps, managed mostly by the army, were the city's first large answer to that fact. They were also a bridge between emergency and policy. At first, the tents solved the immediate problem of exposure. They gave thousands of people a place to sleep when their homes no longer existed. But tents were not a long-term solution for a city facing months of recovery. Weather, sanitation, privacy, and the approach of winter all pressed against the limits of canvas shelter. The grid of numbered tents could impose order, but it could not make temporary fabric into a lasting home. So the refugee system began to point toward another form of emergency housing. The same displaced population that had been organized into camps would soon be moved, in part, into small wooden structures built for longer use. These would become known as earthquake cottages. They were still temporary in origin, still born from disaster, and still tied to public management. But they marked a shift from tents and directories toward walls, roofs, rent, and the hope that a family might again possess something that felt, however modestly, like a home. The move from tents to cottages did not end displacement. It changed its shape. Canvas had answered the first emergency. It gave thousands of people a place to sleep after streets, houses, boarding rooms, and hotels had burned. It could be arranged in rows, numbered, inspected, and mapped. But as the months passed after April 18th, 1906, the limits of tent life became harder to ignore. A tent could mark a family's assigned space, but it could not offer much protection against cold, damp, illness, or the long strain of living publicly. It could not easily restore privacy. It could not give the displaced the feeling that recovery had actually begun. As winter approached, San Francisco's relief system turned toward wood. The result was one of the most recognizable forms of housing to come out of the disaster, the earthquake cottage. These were small wooden structures built for people who still had no permanent home. They were not grand symbols of reconstruction. They were modest, practical, and temporary in origin. But that modesty is part of why they matter. They show recovery at the scale of daily life, not in the language of monuments or business districts, but in walls, roofs, rent, and the possibility of staying dry through the season ahead. About 5,300 earthquake cottages were built. In a city where about 225,000 people had been made homeless, that number did not solve the housing crisis. It could not. But it represented a major shift in the refugee system. The official camps had begun as places of emergency control and survival, many of them managed by the United States Army. Now the same emergency network was trying to create something more durable than ordered rows of canvas. The city was still managing refugees, but it was also creating a path, however narrow, from relief toward ownership. The cottages were small wooden buildings, and their importance lay partly in their material. Wood meant a harder boundary between inside and outside. It meant a door, not just a tent flap. It meant a roof that could better withstand rain. It meant a structure that could be moved, occupied, repaired, and for some families, eventually claimed. After months in camps, those differences were not cosmetic. They were the difference between surviving in public and beginning again in private. At peak occupancy, the earthquake cottages housed 16,448 refugees. That figure is precise, and it helps us understand both the achievement and the limitation of the program. Tens of thousands of people could not simply step back into the city they had known. The burned district had erased housing stock on a scale that ordinary markets could not immediately replace. Even where streets reopened and businesses returned, the people who had lost the least power often had the easiest path back. For many others, the cottage was neither a full recovery nor a mere shelter. It was an intermediate condition, a place between catastrophe and permanence. The payment system captured that same in-between status. Tenants paid $2 per month toward a $50 purchase price. This was not free housing in the sense of a gift detached from obligation. It was not normal private housing either. It was a relief arrangement that asked residents to pay gradually for the structure they occupied. The monthly amount was small, but the meaning was large. It linked emergency shelter to property and property to the promise of self-sufficiency. For the city and relief administrators, the cottages helped move people out of tents. For the tenants, the arrangement offered a chance to possess something tangible after losing nearly everything. A $50 purchase price placed a cottage within the realm of aspiration, even if not everyone could make the payments easily. $2 per month turned recovery into a schedule. Each payment suggested progress, but also reminded residents that their shelter remained bound to rules, accounting, and official oversight. This is one of the quieter contradictions of the earthquake cottages. They were humane compared with months of tent life, especially as winter came closer. They were also part of a managed refugee system. A family could gain walls and a roof, but the circumstances of that shelter were still shaped by authorities, policies, camp locations, and the broader politics of rebuilding. The cottages softened the emergency without ending the dependency created by it. They also reveal something important about time after disaster. The earthquake itself had lasted less than a minute of strong shaking. The fires had burned for 3 days, but displacement stretched across seasons and then years. Public memory often prefers the dramatic sequence, the shock before dawn, the flames, the ruins, the triumphant rebuilding. The cottages interrupt that rhythm. They belong to the slower middle, when people were still waiting, paying, moving, salvaging, and adapting. For a family moving from a tent into a cottage, the change may have felt practical before it felt symbolic. There was more protection from weather. There was likely more room for household routines. There was a clearer division between one family's space and another's. In the tent camps, order had been created through grids, numbers, and directories. In the cottage system, order was created through small buildings and monthly accounts. Both systems made displacement legible to administrators. But the cottage also made survival feel, at least for some, more domestic. That domestic quality is why the earthquake cottages endured in the city's memory. They were built as emergency housing, but they did not simply disappear when the immediate crisis passed. Their later scattering across San Francisco would become part of the city's unfinished recovery. Some were moved from camp settings into other neighborhoods. Some remained visible long after the official emergency had faded. In that sense, the cottages became physical reminders that rebuilding was not just the return of banks, streetcars, offices, and public buildings. It was also the reassembling of ordinary life by people who had to carry disaster with them, sometimes literally, in the form of a small wooden house. The numbers keep the story grounded. About 5,300 cottages, 16,448 refugees at peak occupancy, $2 per month toward $50. These figures are not just administrative facts. They describe the scale of need, the design of relief, and the boundaries of opportunity. They also show that recovery was structured. It was not simply a natural return to normal life once the flames died out. It required institutions to decide who would be housed, where, under what terms, and for how long. And those decisions were never neutral in a city marked by race, land value, political power, and unequal citizenship. The cottages tell one part of the displacement story, how refugees moved from tents into wooden shelters as winter approached. But other survivors faced a different struggle, not only for shelter, but for the right to return to the ground where their community had stood. In Chinatown, destruction opened the door to a more aggressive political ambition. Some officials saw the burned neighborhood not as a place to restore, but as land to reclaim for a different San Francisco. There, recovery would become a fight over whether a community could come home at all. The cottages showed how recovery could be organized through rent, rules, and small wooden walls. But in Chinatown, the question was even more basic. It was not only whether displaced residents would receive shelter. It was whether they would be permitted to return to the neighborhood where their homes, businesses, temples, associations, and daily life had stood before the fire. The earthquake and the flames destroyed Chinatown, along with much of the city center. In the burned district, loss was already immense. But for Chinese residents, destruction carried an added danger. It created an opening for people in power to treat catastrophe as an opportunity. If the neighborhood had been reduced to ash, some San Francisco officials believed it did not have to be rebuilt where it had been. The disaster could be used to redraw the city's racial geography. Before the earthquake, Chinatown occupied valuable ground near the heart of San Francisco. It was close to the financial district, close to the commercial core, and close to the routes through which the city imagined its future prosperity. That location mattered. After the fire, when so much land had to be reconsidered, rebuilt, insured, bought, sold, and regulated, the old hostility toward Chinatown joined with the new urgency of reconstruction. The result was a plan to move the Chinese community away from the central city. The proposed destination was Hunter's Point. That name placed the issue plainly. This was not a plan to help residents rebuild where they already lived. It was a plan to remove Chinatown from its historic location and relocate it to the southeastern edge of San Francisco. In the language of recovery, officials could speak of order, sanitation, improvement, and civic rebuilding, but the effect would have been permanent displacement. A community that had already lost buildings to earthquake and fire would also lose its place in the city. The National Park Service account of the disaster gives a sharp sense of the scale of the rupture. It notes that Chinatown had about 15,000 Chinese residents before the disaster, and that about 400 remained in the city immediately afterward. Those figures do not simply describe population movement. They show how fire, fear, exclusion, and official decision-making converged. Thousands of people were scattered at the very moment when decisions about land and return were being made. The refugee system reflected that separation. Among the camps at the Presidio was an isolated camp for refugees from Chinatown. Earlier chapters have followed the broader structure of camps, with the United States Army managing most of the official refugee sites and imposing a kind of military order on civilian displacement. But the Chinatown camp points to something more specific. Relief was not experienced in the same way by every survivor. Even inside a citywide emergency, race shaped where people were placed, how they were grouped, and how their future was imagined by authorities. This is why Chinatown's recovery cannot be treated as simply one neighborhood story among many. It reveals a larger pattern of disaster politics. Earthquakes do not decide who has a right to land. Fires do not decide which communities belong near the center of a city. Those decisions are made afterward, in meetings, ordinances, relief plans, rebuilding schemes, and the quiet pressure of people who see opportunity in ruin. San Francisco officials attempted to make the relocation permanent. The plan to move Chinatown to Hunter's Point was not a minor administrative adjustment. It would have broken the connection between a community and one of the most important Chinese urban neighborhoods in the United States. Chinatown was not only a collection of structures. It was a dense social world, built under pressure, shaped by exclusion, work, commerce, family ties, district associations, and the daily realities of Chinese life in a hostile political environment. The neighborhood's destruction made that social world vulnerable. Buildings had burned. Records, shops, lodging houses, and streetscapes had been damaged or erased. In a purely physical sense, the land could be cleared and replanned. But communities are not only physical. They are also networks of claim, memory, labor, and necessity. To relocate Chinatown to Hunter's Point would have meant forcing those networks to restart under official terms in a place chosen by others. The plan failed. That failure is important because it shows the limits of official power, even in a moment when emergency authority was broad. The earthquake and fire had given city leaders room to act quickly. The refugee crisis had put thousands of people under camp administration. The rebuilding process had made land use seem negotiable. Yet Chinese residents were eventually allowed to return and rebuild Chinatown where it had stood. The word allowed carries weight here. It reminds us that return was not treated as automatic. For many San Franciscans, rebuilding meant finding materials, money, labor, and permission. For Chinese residents, it also meant overcoming a political effort to erase their neighborhood from its central location. Their return was not simply a natural consequence of the fire ending. It was a contested outcome. This struggle also complicates the larger story of San Francisco's recovery. The city would later tell a powerful story about speed, resilience, and rebirth. Streets were cleared. Buildings rose. Refugee camps became cottages. Businesses reopened. Civic leaders looked for ways to show that San Francisco remained a modern, ambitious city. But Chinatown exposes the uneven foundation of that story. The same recovery that could be celebrated as progress could also be used to intensify exclusion. In this sense, the attempted relocation to Hunter's Point belongs beside the other defining mechanisms of the disaster. Broken gas mains fed the fires. Broken water mains crippled firefighting. Dynamiting buildings sometimes added to the destruction it was meant to stop. Camps brought order, but also surveillance and control. Cottages offered shelter, but under rules of rent and purchase. And in Chinatown, reconstruction became a test of whether emergency power could be used to permanently displace a racialized community from valuable urban land. The answer, in the end, was no. Chinatown returned. Chinese residents rebuilt. The neighborhood survived the attempt to remove it. But survival should not be mistaken for ease. Return did not erase the losses of April 18, 1906, or the days of fire that followed. It did not erase the fear created by official relocation plans. It did not make recovery equal. It meant that, despite the destruction of the neighborhood and the attempt to move it to Hunter's Point, Chinese residents retained a place in the rebuilt city. That fact matters because it changes how we understand reconstruction. San Francisco was not rebuilt by a single public will. It was rebuilt through conflict among institutions, property interests, relief agencies, officials, and displaced people with unequal power. Some survivors moved from tents into cottages. Some remained in camps under army administration. Some returned to lots where their homes had burned. Others had to defend the right to return before rebuilding could even begin. Chinatown's fight to return, therefore, sits at the center of the disaster's meaning. It shows that recovery was not only a question of engineering, finance, or architectural speed. It was a question of belonging. Who could claim the city after the fire? Who could be moved in the name of improvement? Who had enough power to resist being written out of the rebuilt map? By the time Chinese residents were allowed to rebuild Chinatown, San Francisco's recovery was already becoming a long, uneven process rather than a clean turning point. The city had camps, cottages, isolated communities, returning neighborhoods, and people still waiting for permanence. The flames had ended after 3 days, but displacement lasted far longer. Across the city, temporary shelter and incomplete return would continue to define daily life, long after the first emergency had passed. By the time Chinatown's residents fought their way back onto the city's map, San Francisco's recovery had already become something more complicated than rebuilding streets and walls. The emergency had not ended when the flames went out. It had not ended when tents were raised in ordered rows, or when small wooden cottages began replacing canvas as winter approached. Recovery was becoming a long condition of life, measured not only in contracts and new construction, but in months of waiting, rules, rent, relocation, and uncertainty. The city that emerged after the earthquake and fire was not one city returning all at once. It was a city divided between those who could rebuild quickly and those who remained dependent on public shelter. Some residents found rooms, relatives, work, or credit. Some returned to damaged lots and began again. Others remained in the official refugee system, living under arrangements that had begun as emergency relief but slowly became a semi-permanent feature of the landscape. This is one of the quietest but most important facts of the disaster. San Francisco's public image would soon depend on speed, confidence, and visible reconstruction. But for thousands of people, the pace of recovery was much slower. The burned district could be cleared. Business could resume. Newspapers could speak of renewal. Yet families still lived in camps. Earthquake cottages still stood where tents had once been. Temporary housing, designed as a bridge between catastrophe and normal life, became its own long chapter. The official refugee camps had been created because the scale of homelessness was too large for ordinary charity or municipal habit. The United States Geological Survey lists about 225,000 people homeless from a San Francisco population of about 400,000. That figure helps explain why the city became, in effect, a landscape of organized displacement. The United States Army managed 21 of San Francisco's 26 official refugee camps. The Presidio held several of them, including an isolated camp for refugees from Chinatown. Across these spaces, the Army and relief authorities tried to impose order on a population uprooted by fire. At first, the camp system answered the most immediate needs. It created places where food, water, medical attention, and sanitation could be administered. It allowed officials to count people, assign shelter, and maintain rules. In some camps, tents were arranged on a street grid pattern, numbered, and connected to corner directories so that what looked like temporary shelter could be navigated almost like a miniature city. This mattered because the earthquake had not only destroyed buildings, it had destroyed addresses. It had broken the daily geography by which people knew where to find one another. But order did not mean permanence, and it did not mean comfort. Camps were meant to manage displacement, not solve it. They could shelter people from immediate exposure, but they could not restore lost wages, burned homes, vanished possessions, or legal security. They could not give every family a neighborhood back. They could not erase the fact that some communities, including Chinatown, had to fight political attempts to move them elsewhere. In that sense, the camps were both relief and evidence. They proved that the city had acted, but they also proved how much remained undone. The Earthquake Cottages were supposed to move recovery forward. As winter approached, San Francisco built about 5,300 of these small wooden structures for people still in need of housing. They offered walls and roofs instead of canvas. At peak occupancy, they housed 16,448 refugees. Tenants paid $2 per month toward a $50 purchase price, a system that made the cottages more than donated shelter but less than ordinary private housing. That payment structure reveals a great deal about the recovery. The cottages were temporary in origin, but they also carried the promise of ownership. They were relief housing, but they were not purely free relief. They were modest, standardized, and publicly managed, yet for many residents, they represented the possibility of a controlled transition back into private life. A family might not have recovered its former home, but it might be able to claim a small building, pay toward it, and eventually move it. Still, the cottage system also showed how uneven recovery remained. A cottage was better than a tent, but it was not the same as returning to a full home, a stable block, or a restored livelihood. It was a halfway measure, built from lumber and necessity. It turned a refugee into a tenant, and perhaps eventually into an owner, but it did not automatically restore what the fire had taken. The word cottage could sound gentle, almost pastoral. In practice, these were emergency structures born from a citywide housing collapse. The long life of the camps makes that point even more clearly. The last official refugee camp did not close until June 1908. That was more than 2 years after the earthquake and fire of April 18, 1906. By then, San Francisco had already been rebuilding for a long time. New buildings had risen. Streets had been cleared. Commercial life had resumed in many forms. The city could begin to tell a story of survival and return. But the closing of the last official camp did not mean every displaced person had recovered. It meant the official camp system had ended. The difference matters. When the final camp closed, earthquake cottages remained scattered across San Francisco. Temporary structures outlived the temporary system that had produced them. They became part of the city's post-disaster geography, standing as reminders that public recovery and personal recovery did not move at the same speed. This scattered afterlife of the cottages complicates the usual image of reconstruction. Rebuilding is often imagined as a sequence: disaster, relief, rebuilding, recovery. San Francisco's experience was messier. Relief structures became homes. Emergency arrangements stretched into years. Neighborhood return depended on money, race, politics, and access to land. Some people moved from tents to cottages and then into more permanent situations. Others carried the disaster with them in the form of reduced choices and altered futures. The city's recovery was also shaped by what was visible and what could be hidden. Ruins were visible. Fires were visible. New buildings were visible. Camps, too, were visible while they remained concentrated in official spaces. But once cottages were scattered, displacement became easier to overlook. A family living in a small wooden earthquake cottage might no longer appear as part of a refugee crisis, even if that cottage existed only because the crisis had never fully resolved for them. That is why the date of June 1908 should not be treated as a clean ending. It was an administrative milestone, not a moral conclusion. The authorities could close a camp. They could end a category. They could remove the visible apparatus of mass refuge. But they could not make recovery equal simply by declaring the official emergency over. In the years after the disaster, San Francisco worked hard to present itself as a city rebuilt. And in many ways, that was true. The scale of reconstruction was immense. But beneath that civic confidence lay another story, one of people still living in the shadow of emergency decisions, in cottages that had begun as temporary relief, in neighborhoods where return had been contested, and in a political system where power and money had not paused for the sake of public suffering. The camps and cottages reveal the human geography of unfinished recovery. They show how a disaster can continue long after the fire is extinguished, not as flame or falling brick, but as uncertainty over shelter, ownership, belonging, and authority. They also point toward a darker layer of the rebuilt city. While refugees navigated rules, rents, and relocation, San Francisco's political world was entering its own reckoning. The same aftermath that exposed the need for shelter also exposed the machinery of influence, bribery, and private advantage beneath public life. In the ruins, recovery and corruption would prove difficult to separate. The camps and cottages showed one kind of unfinished recovery, people living under rules they had not made, paying rent toward small wooden shelters, waiting for stability after the fire had erased the ordinary map of home. But beneath that human geography was another map, less visible and just as important. It was a map of influence, city officials, political brokers, police power, public utilities, private companies, and money moving through the machinery of government. The earthquake did not create that machinery. It exposed it. In the months after April 18, 1906, San Francisco was not only rebuilding streets, water lines, homes, businesses, and public confidence. It was also entering one of the most consequential corruption investigations in the city's history. The Museum of the City of San Francisco timeline places the Graft prosecutions directly in the aftermath of the disaster, when the city's need for reconstruction made public authority even more valuable than before. Franchises, contracts, utility privileges, transportation routes, and political protection all mattered in a city trying to come back from ruin. At the center of the scandal stood Abraham Ruef. Ruef was not mayor, but he was one of the essential political figures in the Ruef-Schmitz machine. Mayor Eugene E. Schmitz held the public office. Ruef operated as the political boss, the strategist, the fixer, the man whose influence connected City Hall to private interests. Together, their names became shorthand for a system in which public decisions could be bent toward private advantage. That system was not an abstraction. It involved people with titles and institutions with power. According to the Museum of the City of San Francisco timeline, Abraham Ruef, Mayor Eugene E. Schmitz, members of the Board of Supervisors, the police chief, and corporate officers of major utilities were indicted for graft and bribery after the disaster. The list matters because it shows the breadth of what was being alleged. This was not a story of one envelope changing hands in a back room. The indictments reached into the mayor's office, the city's legislative body, the police department, and corporations connected to the basic services of urban life. In a city where broken mains had helped turn an earthquake into a firestorm, where transportation, communication, gas, electricity, and streetcar systems were central to rebuilding, utility power was civic power. The companies and utility interests associated with the Graft timeline included PG&E, United Railroads, and what became Pacific Telephone. These were not marginal actors. They were tied to the daily systems that allowed a modern city to function. Electric service, gas service, transit, and telephone communication were part of the infrastructure of recovery. Decisions about them shaped not only profit, but the rebuilt city itself. That is why the Graft story belongs here, among the ruins, not as a separate political episode detached from the earthquake. Disasters concentrate authority. They make speed feel necessary. They create urgent demands for permits, contracts, franchises, relief, policing, rebuilding, and access to land. In that atmosphere, the boundary between public necessity and private opportunity can become dangerously thin. San Francisco, in the disaster's aftermath, was a city where almost every major question carried financial value. Who would rebuild? Where would people live? Which neighborhoods would return? Which companies would receive permissions or advantages? Which officials could approve, delay, protect, or punish? The same political system that had to manage emergency and reconstruction was also the system under investigation for bribery and graft. For residents in camps and cottages, corruption may have seemed distant from the immediate struggle for shelter, but the two worlds were connected. A refugee waiting in a tent, a family paying $2 a month toward a $50 cottage, a community fighting for the right to return to its neighborhood, and a company seeking a valuable franchise all lived inside the same municipal order. City government could organize relief. It could regulate camps. It could attempt to relocate Chinatown. It could also grant privileges to utilities and transportation companies. The integrity of that government mattered at every level. The indictments named the political architecture of the problem. The Board of Supervisors was central because supervisors could vote on franchises and city privileges. The mayor mattered because executive power gave legitimacy and access. The police chief mattered because policing could protect a system, enforce its choices, or help preserve political control. Corporate officers mattered because bribery requires more than officials willing to receive. It also requires private interests willing to pay for advantage. The Museum of the City of San Francisco timeline frames the scandal as part of a broader effort to break a cycle of bribery and graft involving city government and utilities. That phrase, a cycle, is important. It suggests repetition rather than accident. It suggests a pattern in which public power and private gain had become mutually reinforcing. Utilities needed permissions, franchises, and favorable treatment. Officials and political brokers could turn those needs into sources of money and influence. Once established, such a cycle could become difficult to interrupt because too many people benefited from keeping it alive. The earthquake and fire disrupted the city physically. The graft prosecutions aimed at a different kind of disruption, political interruption. They tried to expose how decisions were being made, who was paying, who was receiving, and who had been using public office as an instrument of private reward. Yet the timing also produced a contradiction. San Francisco needed confidence. It needed investment. It needed to persuade residents, insurers, businesses, and the wider nation that it could recover. Public corruption investigations threatened that image. They suggested that behind the rebuilding city was a government compromised by the very interests that would help shape the rebuilt landscape. This did not mean reconstruction stopped. Buildings rose. Streets reopened. Refugee camps closed. Cottages were moved, bought, altered, and absorbed into the city. Chinatown fought its way back. But the graft investigations revealed that recovery was not only a matter of physical endurance. It was also a contest over legitimacy. Could the rebuilt San Francisco claim to be renewed if the political order beneath it remained corrupt? Abraham Ruef and Eugene E. Schmitz became the most visible names in that question. Schmitz, as mayor, represented official civic leadership. Ruef represented the backstage machinery that could make official leadership serve other ends. Together, they embodied the fear that the city's political life had become a marketplace where influence could be bought, sold, and protected. But the scandal was larger than either man. The presence of supervisors in the indictments pointed to institutional weakness. The presence of the police chief pointed to enforcement power entangled with politics. The presence of corporate officers from major utilities pointed to the private side of corruption, where companies that provided essential services could seek advantage through bribery rather than public accountability. For a city recovering from a disaster rooted partly in infrastructure failure, that private-public relationship carried special weight. Earlier chapters have followed how ruptured gas mains fed fires, how broken water mains crippled firefighting, and how the failure of urban systems turned seconds of shaking into days of destruction. Afterward, the companies and franchises tied to urban systems were not background details. They were central to the future safety, organization, and power of the city. The graft prosecutions therefore changed the meaning of the ruins. The ruins were not only evidence of seismic force and fire. They became a setting in which old political habits could be examined under harsh light. The city's burned blocks, refugee camps, and reconstruction needs created the conditions for a public reckoning over who had governed San Francisco and for whose benefit. Still, exposure was not the same as transformation. Indictments could name a system. They could bring officials and corporate officers into court. They could give reformers a cause and the public a language for outrage. But breaking a machine was harder than describing it. Political influence does not disappear simply because it is revealed. It adapts, defends itself, and waits for public attention to fade. That tension would define the next stage of the story. Former Mayor James Phelan, financier Rudolph Spreckels, and prosecutor Francis Henney would become associated with the reform drive against the Ruef Schmitz machine. Their campaign would promise accountability in a city still trying to prove that it had not only survived, but improved. Yet the record of the prosecutions would also reveal the limits of reform. The scandal reached many names, offices, and companies, but punishment would not fall evenly. In San Francisco's recovery, the visible city and the political city were rebuilt at the same time. One rose in timber, brick, steel, streets, camps, cottages, and returning neighborhoods. The other was tested in indictments, testimony, alliances, and prosecutions. Beneath the ruins, the question was no longer only how a city rebuilds after fire. It was whether a city can rebuild its public life when corruption has been part of the foundation. The question left by the Graft investigations was not simply whether San Francisco could identify corruption. It was whether exposure could become lasting reform. After the fire, that question carried unusual weight. The city was rebuilding streets, housing, commercial districts, and public confidence at the same time. Every new wall and every restored service seemed to ask whether the rebuilt city would be different from the one that had burned. The reform drive associated with former Mayor James Phelan, financier Rudolph Spreckels, and prosecutor Francis Henney emerged in that atmosphere. Their campaign was directed against the Ruef Schmitz machine, the political system identified with Abraham Ruef and Mayor Eugene E. Schmitz. In the public memory of the disaster, the earthquake and fire could appear as a clean break, a moment when the old city vanished and a new one began. But the Graft prosecutions complicated that story. They showed that the ruins did not erase the old arrangements of power. They exposed them. Abraham Ruef was not simply another name on a list of indictments. He stood at the center of the machine as a political broker, a man whose influence connected office holders, favors, and private interests. Eugene E. Schmitz, as mayor, gave that machine public authority. Together, Ruef and Schmitz represented a form of urban politics in which access to city government could be organized, traded, and protected. The disaster did not create that world, but the aftermath made it harder to ignore. A city dependent on permits, utilities, franchises, contracts, policing, and rebuilding decisions was also a city vulnerable to the private sale of public power. That is why the reform campaign mattered. Phelan, Spreckels, and Henney were not only pursuing individual wrongdoing. They were trying to break what the Museum of the City of San Francisco timeline describes as a cycle of bribery and graft involving city government and utilities. The targets of investigation reached beyond the mayor's office. The timeline places Ruef, Schmitz, members of the Board of Supervisors, the police chief, and corporate officers of major utilities within the wider pattern of indictments for graft and bribery after the disaster. It also names corporate and utility interests, including PG&E, United Railroads, and what became Pacific Telephone in the graft context. Those names are important because they show how corruption could become embedded in the ordinary machinery of a modern city. It was not only a matter of envelopes, favors, or personal enrichment. It was also about infrastructure and permission. Street railways, electric power, gas service, telephone systems, and police authority were not abstractions. They were part of daily life and part of recovery. After the earthquake, San Francisco needed functioning systems urgently. But when companies that controlled urban services were tied to political influence, the boundary between public need and private advantage became difficult to defend. The reformers' task was therefore larger than prosecution. It was to restore belief that municipal government could act in the public interest. James Phelan brought the authority of a former mayor. Rudolph Spreckels brought financial power and civic prominence. Francis Henney brought prosecutorial force. Together, they became associated with a drive to make the city's hidden arrangements visible and punishable. Their effort fit the broader progressive era belief that corruption could be exposed, institutions could be cleaned, and government could be made more accountable. But San Francisco's graft prosecutions also showed the limits of that belief. The investigations produced dramatic accusations and a wide circle of defendants, but consequences did not fall equally. The Office of Justice Program's summary of Franklin Hitchborn's study states the blunt conclusion: Abraham Ruef was the only defendant in the San Francisco graft prosecutions who went to prison. That fact gives the reform story its tension. If Ruef alone went to prison, then the prosecutions were both significant and incomplete. They reached the political boss at the center of the machine, but they did not produce a broad pattern of imprisonment across all the public officials, police figures, supervisors, and corporate officers whose names appeared in the scandal's orbit. The machine could be exposed without being fully dismantled. Accountability could be real without being evenly distributed. This is one of the harder truths in the history of the rebuilt city. Reform can change a public story without changing every structure beneath it. It can name wrongdoing, gather testimony, win convictions, and still leave many forms of influence intact. In San Francisco, after 1906, the language of renewal was everywhere. Refugee camps were closing. Cottages were being moved or absorbed into neighborhoods. Chinatown had fought to return. Business districts were rising again. Yet the graft prosecutions suggested that rebuilding a city's moral and political life was slower and less visible than rebuilding its skyline. Ruef's punishment became a symbol, but symbols can do two kinds of work. They can clarify responsibility, giving the public a figure through whom a complicated scandal becomes understandable. They can also narrow responsibility, allowing a wider system to appear resolved once one central figure is punished. The record summarized by the Office of Justice Programs through Hitchborn's study forces that distinction into view. Ruef went to prison. The broader world of graft, bribery, corporate influence, and municipal vulnerability was harder to contain in a single sentence. Schmitz, too, remained central to the meaning of the scandal because he had been the elected mayor during the period associated with the machine. His role reminds us that corruption does not operate outside politics alone. It can live inside formal authority. It can use offices, boards, departments, and legal processes as instruments. A political boss may arrange influence, but elected officials and city agencies give influence its practical force. That is why the indictments of members of the Board of Supervisors and the police chief matter alongside the names of Ruef and Schmitz. The scandal was not merely personal. It was institutional. The involvement of major utilities made the issue even more consequential. San Francisco, after the earthquake, had learned, in the most violent way, that urban systems could determine life and death. Broken gas mains fed fires. Broken water mains crippled firefighting. Streetcars, telephones, electric systems, police power, and public franchises were all part of the city's ability to function. If such systems were entangled with bribery, then corruption was not just a moral failing. It was a threat to public welfare. The same city that had seen infrastructure fail under geological stress now had to confront the possibility that its political infrastructure had failed under the pressure of money and influence. The reformers' campaign therefore belongs inside the earthquake story, not beside it. It was part of the aftermath. The disaster created the conditions in which questions of power became urgent. Who would rebuild? Who would profit? Who would return? Who would be relocated? Who would be protected? And who would be blamed? The graft prosecutions did not answer all of those questions, but they revealed that the physical reconstruction of San Francisco could not be separated from struggles over legitimacy. By the early years after the fire, the city was already shaping a new public image. It wanted to be seen as resilient, efficient, modern, and reborn. That desire was understandable. San Franciscans had endured earthquake, fire, mass homelessness, temporary camps, contested neighborhoods, and the long work of rebuilding. But the Ruef-Schmitz scandal meant that the story of recovery could not be told as simple uplift. The rebuilt city carried evidence of courage and ambition, but also evidence of exclusion, emergency rule, unequal return, and political corruption. The limits of reform did not make reform meaningless. Phelan, Spreckels, and Heaney helped turn private arrangements into public questions. They forced the city to look at the relationship between government and corporate power. They made the Ruef-Schmitz machine part of the historical record of the disaster's aftermath. But the fact that Ruef alone went to prison warns against mistaking exposure for transformation. A city may prosecute corruption and still preserve habits that made corruption possible. San Francisco would soon present itself to the world as a city remade. On the waterfront at Harborview, on the site of today's Marina District, a vast exposition would rise as a display of recovery and confidence. It would show beauty, order, architecture, and civic ambition. But beneath that public performance stood the history traced through these ruins: fire carried by broken systems, refugees housed under authority, Chinatown's contested return, cottages scattered after the camps closed, and reformers who found that even a shattered city could not easily separate rebuilding from power. By the time San Francisco prepared to present itself at Harborview, the city had already told many stories about its own recovery. Some were visible in new buildings and restored streets. Some were written in court records, indictments, and the uneven results of reform. Some remained in smaller traces: cottages moved from campgrounds into neighborhoods, families reassembling lives after displacement, Chinatown returning despite official efforts to push it away. The Panama Pacific International Exposition gathered those stories into one grand public image. It opened on February 20th, 1915, on 635 acres of San Francisco waterfront at Harbor View, the site of today's Marina District. The fair was tied to a world event, the completion of the Panama Canal, a new route that seemed to promise a reordered age of trade, movement, engineering, and imperial confidence. But for San Francisco, the exposition carried another meaning. PBS describes it as a way for the city to show the world its recovery. That phrase matters. Show the world if the exposition was not only a celebration, it was a performance of civic survival. Less than a decade earlier, the city had been known internationally for earthquake, fire, ruins, camps, and catastrophe. Now it offered visitors a different image: palaces, courts, avenues, sculpture, lights, gardens, and a waterfront transformed into a temporary city of beauty and order. It invited people to see San Francisco not as a warning, but as a triumph. And in many ways, that triumph was real. The fair could not have opened without an extraordinary act of organization. It required land, money, construction, political will, and public belief. PBS reports that San Franciscans bought more than $4 million in exposition bonds at an April 18, 1910 event, and that San Francisco appropriated $5 million for the fair. The date itself was heavy with meaning. April 18th was not a neutral anniversary in San Francisco. It was the day the earthquake struck, the day the rupture began the chain of destruction that ended in fire, displacement, and political reckoning. To attach exposition funding to that date was to turn memory into declaration. The city was saying that the anniversary of disaster could become an anniversary of confidence. The choice of Harborview also carried symbolic weight. The waterfront had always been central to San Francisco's identity, its commerce, its arrivals, its connection to the Pacific world. By placing the exposition on 635 acres there, the city staged recovery at the edge of the bay, in view of the routes and markets it hoped would define its future. The site of today's Marina District became, for a brief period, a carefully composed landscape of ambition. To visitors, the rebuilt city could appear almost miraculous. In 1906, fires had burned for 3 days and destroyed nearly 500 city blocks. Hundreds of thousands had been left homeless. Public systems had failed at the moment they were needed most. Refugee camps had spread across the city, many under army management. Winter had brought earthquake cottages, small wooden shelters that made survival possible, but also revealed the scale of unfinished return. Chinatown had faced not only destruction, but an official attempt to relocate it permanently to Hunter's Point. The Graft investigations had exposed a political world in which public authority and private advantage could be deeply entangled. And yet, in 1915, there stood the exposition. That contrast is why the fair is so important to the end of this story. It did not erase the disaster. It did not undo the deaths, the burned district, the broken water mains, the days of fire, the tents, the camps, the rents, the relocation schemes, or the indictments. But it did show what San Francisco had managed to build after them. The city had not simply waited for time to pass. It had mobilized money, labor, planning, and imagination. It had reconstructed enough of itself to invite the world in. The question is, what kind of recovery the exposition represented? If recovery means the return of business districts, architecture, transportation, and public confidence, then the fair stood as powerful evidence. If recovery means the ability of a city to create a shared image of endurance, then the exposition succeeded brilliantly. It gave San Francisco a stage large enough to replace the image of smoking ruins with one of illuminated palaces and civic ceremony. But if recovery means justice, equal return, accountable government, and repair for everyone displaced by disaster, then the picture becomes less complete. The exposition was built on confidence, but confidence can be selective. It can illuminate some achievements while leaving other histories in shadow. The fire had exposed infrastructure weakness, ruptured gas mains feeding flames, ruptured water mains crippling firefighters, emergency dynamiting adding to destruction when control was already slipping away. The refugee system had brought order, but also authority over people who had lost homes and choices. The earthquake cottages gave shelter, but their very number showed how long emergency life continued after the headlines faded. Chinatown's return was a victory against exclusion, but the attempt to remove it revealed how quickly disaster recovery could become a struggle over land, race, and power. The Graft prosecutions named wrongdoing, but the fact that Abraham Ruef was the only defendant in the San Francisco Graft prosecutions who went to prison warns that exposure and transformation are not the same thing. So the exposition should not be remembered only as a mask. That would be too simple. It was not merely propaganda laid over ruins. It was also evidence of human capacity to rebuild, to organize, to imagine a future after terror. Cities are not rebuilt by symbolism alone, but symbols matter. They help residents believe that the work has meaning. They tell outsiders that a place has not been defeated. They give shape to civic memory. At the same time, the exposition was not the whole truth. It was a chosen truth, arranged on a grand scale. That is the tension at the heart of San Francisco after 1906. The earthquake began underground, along the northern San Andreas Fault, in a rupture that lasted less than a minute for the city, but altered its history for generations. The disaster that followed was made by geology, but also by human systems. The placement of buildings on vulnerable ground, the fragility of water and gas lines, the limits of emergency command, the decisions to dynamite, the administration of camps, the politics of race, the economics of insurance and reconstruction, and the habits of corruption already embedded in public life. By 1915, San Francisco could point to Harborview and say, "We are rebuilt." The statement was true, but not complete. A rebuilt city is not the same as a healed city. Streets can be restored before losses are fully counted. Buildings can rise before power has changed hands. A neighborhood can return while the memory of exclusion remains. A fair can dazzle the world while quieter forms of displacement continue to shape who belongs and who benefits. Still, there is something moving in the fact that the exposition opened at all. Less than 9 years after the morning when the city shook before dawn, San Francisco stood on its waterfront and invited the world to witness a city remade. That achievement deserves recognition. So does the cost beneath it. The Panama Pacific International Exposition gave San Francisco a final image for the age of recovery. Not flames, not tents, not courtrooms, but a vast ceremonial landscape at the edge of the bay. It marked the city's refusal to remain defined by catastrophe. But the deeper story is not only that San Francisco rebuilt. It is how it rebuilt, who was allowed to return, who held power, who paid, who profited, and what memories were polished for public display. In that sense, the exposition was both an ending and a reminder. It closed one chapter of visible ruin, but it did not close the questions opened by the earthquake and fire. Disasters reveal the structures beneath ordinary life. Reconstruction decides which of those structures will be changed and which will be preserved in new materials. San Francisco survived. It burned, scattered, argued, prosecuted, rebuilt, and performed its recovery before the world. The city that emerged was not a simple monument to resilience. It was a city of achievement and contradiction, beauty and damage, reform and limitation. Its rebuilt streets carried the memory of broken ground. Its civic pride carried the memory of camps and exclusion. Its grand exposition carried the memory of fire. And that is why the story of 1906 does not end when the flames go out, or when the last official camp closes, or when the courts finish with the Graft cases. It lingers in the shape of the rebuilt city itself, in the confidence it projected, and in the histories that confidence could not fully contain.